Chicago calls itself the city of big shoulders, commerce, architecture, and the wind off Lake Michigan. For the men in this list, it was a hunting ground. 29 bodies recovered from a single crawl space. 8 student nurses killed in one night. The men responsible became some of the most infamous killers in American history. This is Chicago's most notorious serial killers. Section 1. H. Holmes. The building at the corner of 63rd Street and South Wallace Avenue in Englewood took nearly 3 years to construct, not because of its size, but because Holmes deliberately hired and dismissed each construction crew before they could map the full interior of what they had built. It was 3 stories, brick, long enough to occupy most of its block. The ground floor held commercial units, a pharmacy among them. The upper floors were advertised as hotel accommodation for the 27 million visitors arriving for the 1893 World's Fair, held a mile and a half north along the lakeshore. Behind that advertisement was a gas system Holmes operated from his private office, a chute running from the upper floors to the basement, rooms sealed without external windows, a dissection table, vats large enough to hold an adult, and a kiln built into the basement floor capable of incinerating a human body completely. Holmes had designed all of it before the first guest arrived. The intent preceded the construction. A mile and a half south of the main fairground entrance, at the corner of 63rd Street and South Wallace Avenue in the neighborhood of Englewood, stood a 3-story brick building that had been under construction for most of the preceding 3 years. Locals had watched it go up in pieces, puzzled by the irregular pace of work and the succession of different crews who arrived and departed without finishing what the previous men had started. The building was long and narrow, occupying nearly the full width of its block. It had commercial units on the ground floor, a pharmacy among them, and what the owner advertised as hotel rooms on the upper floors. It had been deliberately positioned so that visitors to the fair could reach it easily by streetcar. To anyone walking past, it looked like a large but unremarkable commercial building. It was not unremarkable. The man who built it was born Herman Webster Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire in 1861. He had qualified as a physician in 1884 from the University of Michigan's medical school, where he had discovered one useful truth about cadavers: that medical institutions would pay well for human skeletons, and that they asked few questions about provenance. He had left a wife and a child behind in New England when he moved to Illinois in 1886, telling neither where he was going. In Chicago, he took work at a pharmacy on the south side, presenting himself with such ease and warmth that the owner trusted him entirely. When the pharmacist died under circumstances that were never fully resolved, Mudgett assumed control of the business. By then, he was calling himself Henry Howard Holmes, or simply H. Holmes, a name he had chosen, by some accounts, in deliberate homage to the fictional English detective who had just appeared in print. The building at 63rd and Wallace was conceived from the beginning as an instrument. Holmes hired multiple architects and multiple construction crews, specifically so that no single person would possess a complete picture of what the structure contained. Workers were dismissed before they could observe too much. New crews were brought in to continue from wherever the previous group had left off. When invoices fell due, Holmes often refused to pay, provoking disputes that gave him legal grounds to remove the tradesmen from the site before they could take stock of what they had built. The result was a building that only one man fully understood. That man had designed it to kill people. The interior, as it was later reconstructed by investigators and described in contemporary press reports, contained rooms fitted with no external windows. It contained a chute that ran from the upper floors directly to the basement. It contained a trapdoor system. Several rooms were constructed so that their walls could conduct gas from a central pipe that Holmes controlled from his own office. Others were soundproofed. The basement held a large kiln capable of incinerating a human body, along with a dissection table, a collection of surgical instruments, and vats large enough to hold an adult. Holmes had sold the design to himself. He had financed the construction through a series of fraudulent loans and unpaid suppliers, meaning the building was constructed substantially on money that would never be repaid to anyone. His victims were overwhelmingly women, most of them young and many of them recently arrived in Chicago. The city had grown faster than its social infrastructure, and there were thousands of women in 1893 who had come looking for work, for independence, or simply for the scale of opportunity that a city of that size advertised. Holmes recruited them through job notices. He hired stenographers and shop assistants and clerks. He took on pharmacists' assistants. He met women at the fair itself, offering accommodation and employment to those who appeared to have nowhere certain to go. He was, by all accounts of the period, persuasive to a degree that many who knew him found difficult to explain afterward. He was physically presentable and spoke with the confidence of a physician. He presented money as no object and prospects as unlimited. Before employing certain women, Holmes required them to take out life insurance policies naming him as the beneficiary. He took out additional policies in his own name on their behalf. The value of these policies varied, but the logic was consistent. The women were worth more to Holmes dead than alive, and the building at 63rd and Wallace had been built to make the transition from alive to dead as private and as complete as possible. Bodies went down the chute to the basement. Some were dissected and the skeletons articulated, then sold to medical schools and anatomy suppliers. Others were cremated in the kiln. The kiln was a practical choice. A crematorium leaves almost nothing for an investigator to work with. The World's Fair ran from May to October 1893. During those months, the hotel above the pharmacy did a brisk trade. Holmes appeared regularly at the fairground. He dressed well, moved confidently, and cultivated the image of a successful professional. He was, simultaneously, operating what may have been the most elaborately premeditated killing environment ever constructed on American soil. The exact number of people who died inside that building remains genuinely uncertain. Holmes would later claim, under various circumstances, that he had killed anywhere between 9 and 200 people. The confession to 200 was almost certainly an exaggeration, partly for the fees he was paid for his story, and partly because he seemed to understand that scale was its own form of theater. Careful analysis by researchers working from contemporary records and the physical evidence found in the building after his arrest suggests that the confirmed number is approximately 9. Several of the people Holmes claimed to have murdered were located alive after his execution. In August 1893, before the fair had closed, the building caught fire. The circumstances were never fully explained, but Holmes had taken out multiple insurance policies on the structure with at least 4 separate companies. When the insurers declined to pay and instead moved toward prosecution for arson, Holmes left Chicago. He moved through several states, running a series of smaller frauds as he went, and eventually settled on a scheme with a man named Benjamin Pitezel. The plan was for Pitezel to fake his own death so that Holmes could collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy that Pitezel held with the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Association of Philadelphia. The policy required proof of death, and it was Holmes who would provide that proof. It was also Holmes who arranged, at some point during the subsequent months, to ensure that Pitezel's death would not need to be faked at all. Pitezel was found dead in Philadelphia in September 1894. The cause was ruled accidental initially. Holmes collected the insurance money and told Pitezel's widow that her husband was still alive, living under cover elsewhere, and that the dead man was someone else entirely. He then spent several months traveling with 3 of the Pitezel children, keeping them separated from their mother, moving them between rented rooms in cities across the Northeast, while their mother and surviving siblings were kept elsewhere, also traveling with Holmes, also believing the family would eventually be reunited. The children were Howard, Nellie, and Alice. Howard was 6 years old. His body was found months later in a cellar in Irvington, Indiana. The remains of Nellie and Alice were recovered from a trunk buried in the garden of a house Holmes had rented in Toronto. Investigators believed all 3 had been killed to eliminate witnesses. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894. The charge that brought him in was horse theft, a fraud he had been running in Texas. He was held while investigators in multiple jurisdictions began to piece together the sequence of events surrounding Pitezel's death and the disappearances of Pitezel's children. He was transferred to Philadelphia, where he faced murder charges. There, the police connected him back to Chicago, and a broader investigation of the building at 63rd and Wallace began. What investigators found in the basement, even months and years after the building had last been used, was enough to persuade them that they were dealing with something they had no established framework to describe. Bone fragments, hair, burned clothing, personal effects belonging to people who had not been seen since the period of the World's Fair. Holmes stood trial in Philadelphia, not in Illinois, because the murder of Paetzel was the charge most easily proven with existing evidence. He conducted much of his own defense, presenting himself throughout proceedings with what observers described as a composed and almost studied calm. He was convicted of the murder of Benjamin Paetzel in November 1895 after a short trial. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging. Holmes, who knew better than most what could be done to a body after death, made one specific request before his execution: that his coffin be filled with cement, sealing him permanently from external examination. The request was granted. He was executed in Philadelphia on May 7, 1896. He was 34 years old. The building at 63rd and Wallace was demolished in the years following his conviction. A post office now occupies the site. Before the building was demolished, it burned again, in August 1895, a fire later attributed to arson, though no one was ever charged. There was speculation at the time that someone wished to destroy what remained inside. Before the fire, however, investigators had recovered enough from the structure to confirm that the basement had been used for something beyond what any legitimate commercial operation required. The presence of surgical instruments, the kiln, the chute, and the architectural features designed to isolate and contain were not in dispute. The number question persisted long after the execution. Holmes had a financial motive to inflate his body count. He was paid $7,500 by a Hearst newspaper syndicate for the rights to his full confession, and a higher number made for a more valuable property. His confession to 27 murders, published after his death, included several people who were later confirmed to be alive. The claim of 200 was made verbally in the weeks before his execution and was never supported by physical evidence. The working figure accepted by most researchers who have examined the primary sources is somewhere between 9 confirmed and a somewhat larger number that cannot be established beyond reasonable doubt. The building was in operation for several years, during which an indeterminate number of women and at least 3 children died. The Paetzel three, at minimum, are established. A small number of women connected to the hotel's operation disappeared during the period of the fair and were never found. What is not in question is the scale of the premeditation. The building was designed before the murders began. The chute, the kiln, the gas lines, the soundproofed rooms, the trapdoors, these were not improvised. Holmes had studied human anatomy, understood what decomposition left behind, and built a structure whose entire purpose was to prevent detection. The operating logic was as cold as any in the history of American crime. Bodies sold to medical schools generated income. Insurance policies on victims generated income. The building itself, insured with multiple companies simultaneously, was another instrument. Holmes did not commit murder as a byproduct of other activity. Murder was the business. Everything else was the cover. The city of Chicago in 1893 was a place where 27 million people arrived over 6 months, looking at exhibits in a gleaming white fairground, and did not look at what was happening a mile and a half down the road. That is perhaps the plainest fact about what Holmes understood. Opportunity scales with crowds. In a city that size, moving that fast, a young woman who stopped being seen was simply a young woman who had moved on. The disappearance of one person in a city of 1 million is not an event. It is a statistic at the edge of a longer list. Holmes built his operation on that understanding. The fair gave him the crowd. The crowd gave him the cover. The building gave him the means. He was the first serial killer to be widely identified and documented as such in American history. Every framework that would later be developed for understanding how a person plans and conceals multiple murders over an extended period begins, in the American context, with the building at 63rd and Wallace Avenue in Englewood, and with the physician from New Hampshire who designed it for a purpose that every one of his construction crews suspected and none of them reported. The city moved on. It always does. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Holmes built his killing ground behind the noise of the most celebrated event in Chicago's history. The next man on this list needed no cover at all. He walked into a room, and he did not leave until 8 people were dead. That case would go to trial the following year, and the sentence that came down would take decades and a Supreme Court ruling to finally resolve. Section 2. Richard Speck. At approximately 11 o'clock on the night of Wednesday, July 13, 1966, Richard Speck knocked on the door of the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood. He was 24 years old, a drifter with a criminal record running back to his teens, and he had spent the day 200 feet down the same street at the National Maritime Union Hiring Hall, trying and failing to secure a berth on a Great Lakes ore vessel. He had spent the evening drinking and had, earlier that night, raped a 53-year-old woman named Ella Mae Hooper at knife point at the Shipyard Inn. When Corazon Amurao opened the door, Speck produced a pistol and told her he needed money to get to New Orleans and that nobody would be harmed. He pushed inside. 9 young women were in the building. By the time morning came, 8 of them were dead. Richard Franklin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, a small town about 200 miles west of Chicago. He was the 7th of 8 children. His father died when Richard was 6. His mother remarried, and the family relocated to the Dallas area of Texas, where Speck spent most of his adolescence in a state of near-constant trouble. By the time he was a young adult, he had accumulated a substantial criminal record of break-ins, thefts, and assaults. He was an alcoholic before he was 20. He had been married, had fathered a child, and had been separated from his wife by 1966. He came back to Chicago in early 1966 to stay with his sister, whose husband found him work as an apprentice seaman on the Great Lakes ore barges. When there was no assignment, which was often, Speck checked in at the National Maritime Union Hiring Hall on East 100th Street in the hope of picking up a berth. The hiring hall was located at 2335 East 100th Street. The nurse's townhouse was at 2319. The distance between them was approximately 200 feet. On July 13th, Speck went to the hiring hall and was told that a berth he had been assigned to had been taken by a more senior seaman before he arrived. The hall closed before he could secure anything else. He spent the remainder of the afternoon and evening drinking. Sometime that evening, he forced his way into a room at the Shipyard Inn, where he raped a 53-year-old woman named Ella Mae Hooper at knife point. He left without being immediately reported. At around 11 o'clock that night, he knocked on the door of the townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street. Corazon Amurao, a 23-year-old exchange nurse from the Philippines, answered the door. The man standing outside held a small pistol. He told her he needed money to get to New Orleans and that he was not going to hurt anyone. He smelled of alcohol. He pushed inside. He gathered the women present, 6 at first and later 3 more who returned to the building during the early hours of the night, and brought them all into a south bedroom on the upper floor. He used a knife to cut a bedsheet into strips and tied the women's wrists and ankles. He was methodical about this. He tied 8 knots, and all 8 held. He told them repeatedly, over the course of the next several hours, that everything would be all right. He told them he only wanted money. The women believed him, or chose to believe him, or chose not to resist, in the hope that compliance would make him leave. It did not make him leave. Sometime after midnight, and continuing until approximately 3:30 in the morning, Speck began leading the women from the bedroom one by one. He went to Pamela Wilkening first. He untied her ankles and took her from the room. A short time later, she made a single sound. One of the women still tied in the bedroom heard it. Then she heard water running, as if someone in the adjacent bathroom was washing their hands. Then the footsteps returned. Then another woman was taken. This repeated. The exact method varied by victim. Some were strangled, others stabbed, one had her throat slashed. Gloria Davy, 22, the last to be killed, was raped before she died. Her body was found on the sofa downstairs, still in the townhouse when investigators arrived. At some point in the chaos of Speck's first entry into the room, Corazon Amurao rolled beneath a bunk bed and pressed herself against the wall. The bed sat low. The room was dark. Speck did not see her. She stayed there, completely still, for the remainder of the night, listening to the sounds from elsewhere in the townhouse. 8 of her roommates were taken out and killed in the space of roughly 3 hours, one after another, while she lay pressed against a wall under a bed a few feet from where they had been tied. She did not move until nearly 6 in the morning. Then she climbed out of a second-floor window and onto a ledge, and she screamed. The 8 women who died that night were Gloria Jean Davy, 22, Patricia Matisek, 20. Nina Schmale, 24. Pamela Wilkening, 20. Suzanne Ferris, 21. Marianne Jordan, 20. Merlita Gargulo, 22. And Valentina Pasion, 23. All but one were in their early 20s. Several were a month away from completing their nursing qualifications. Marianne Jordan had come from outside the city and had no family nearby. Merlita Gargulo and Valentina Pasion, like Corazon Amorao, were Filipinos in Chicago on exchange programs. They had come to the United States to complete their training and had been placed in the townhouse because the hospital had nowhere else to put them. Speck was identified rapidly. His fingerprints were found throughout the townhouse. Within days, a man who had been drinking with Speck at a bar recognized him from descriptions circulating in the press. The visible marker was a tattoo on Speck's left forearm. It read, in capitals, the words "Born to Raise Hell." It was a large tattoo. It had been described in newspapers. On July 17th, police were called to Cook County Hospital, where staff had admitted a man who had attempted to commit suicide by slashing his wrists and overdosing. A surgical resident examining the patient recognized the tattoo. Police were called. Speck was under arrest before the day was out. The case against him was, from the outset, straightforward in terms of evidence. Fingerprints placed him inside the townhouse. Corazon Amorao had survived and was capable of identification. The physical evidence at the scene was consistent with a single perpetrator operating over several hours. The difficulty, from the prosecution's perspective, was not proving guilt, but managing the conditions in which guilt could be proven fairly. The city of Chicago had been reporting on the murders since the morning of July 14th. The coverage was saturating. Newspapers, radio, and the newly dominant medium of television had placed Speck's name and photograph before essentially every potential juror in Cook County for months before any trial date was set. The case was transferred to Peoria County, about 160 miles southwest of Chicago. It was the first criminal trial in Illinois history to be relocated to another county on the grounds of pretrial publicity. The proceedings opened formally in April 1967. After 6 weeks of individual questioning of 609 prospective jurors. Judge Herbert Passion imposed strict controls: no cameras in the courtroom, no recording equipment, artist sketches prohibited, press credentials capped at 25. Amorao herself had been kept in protective police custody for 7 months before the trial, partly to shield her from the media organizations that were pursuing her for interviews and her account, and partly to preserve the integrity of her testimony. She entered the courthouse on April 5, 1967, through a rear entrance while a decoy wearing dark glasses diverted reporters from the front. She testified for more than 3 hours. The chief prosecutor, William Martin, asked her to use a scale model of the townhouse and 8 small wooden blocks, one for each victim, to describe the sequence of events. She placed the blocks. She described each removal from the bedroom. She described the sounds that came back from elsewhere in the building after each one. Her account was exact in its detail and completely controlled in its delivery. At the end of her testimony, she looked across the courtroom at the defendant and identified him directly. The jury deliberated for 49 minutes. On April 15, 1967, Richard Speck was found guilty on all 8 counts of murder. On June 5th, Judge Passion sentenced him to death by electrocution. The execution never happened. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Furman v. Georgia that existing death penalty statutes as applied constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The ruling invalidated every outstanding death sentence in the country, pending resentencing under new statutes. Speck was resentenced in November 1972 to 8 consecutive prison terms of 50 to 150 years each, a combined minimum of 400 years and a combined maximum of 1,200. The practical effect was that he would die in prison. He was denied parole every time he applied. He maintained throughout most of his imprisonment that he had no memory of the night of July 13. The claim rested on his assertion that he had been heavily intoxicated and had taken drugs before the killings. In 1978, he told a journalist that he had done it. He offered no further explanation. His prison years were largely unremarked until after his death. He died on December 5, 1991, the day before his 50th birthday, of a heart attack at Stateville Correctional Center. He had served 25 years of a sentence that in its paper form ran to 4 centuries. Several years after his death, a videotape recorded inside the prison surfaced publicly. It showed Speck in a prison common area. He had been obtaining female hormones illegally during his imprisonment, and the tape showed the physical effects. He was wearing women's underwear and had developed breast tissue. He was shown with cash, which inmates were prohibited from possessing. He spoke to the camera with apparent ease about what he had done, describing the night of July 13, with a detachment that investigators and prosecutors found consistent with everything they had known about him in court. The tape was understood to have been made sometime in the 1980s. Its release prompted a formal investigation into the conditions at Stateville and led to direct changes in the oversight and monitoring of Illinois state prisons. The Speck case sits at an odd position in the taxonomy of what it covers. Technically, a mass murder is a single event involving multiple victims. A serial killing, by most definitions, requires a cooling-off period between incidents. Speck committed all 8 murders within a few hours, which places the act in one category. But the nature of his conduct, the deliberate selection of each victim in turn, the controlled, methodical manner in which each was taken from the room separately while the others waited, the interval between acts during which he washed his hands, does not read as a single act of escalating violence. It reads as something more considered than that. And investigators who studied the case at length observed that it shared more structural features with serial violence than with the impulsive mass attacks it is most commonly grouped alongside. He was not a man who lost control. He was a man who exercised it. The hiring hall on East 100th Street, where he had gone looking for work on the day of the murders, was 200 feet from the building where 8 women died that night. He had been past it before, in the weeks and months of waiting for assignments that never quite came through. Whether the knowledge that the townhouse was used by nurses, and therefore by young women living without family nearby, was something he registered consciously, or whether the night of July 13 began as something less formed and resolved into something worse as it went on, is a question that no one answered fully, and Speck never addressed directly. The outcome was the same either way. 8 women, 1 night, 1 address on the far south side, the same city. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 murders in a single building, and the lone survivor who kept herself still enough, long enough, to bring the case to trial. The next figure on this list operated for years rather than hours, and his crimes began not in a South Side townhouse, but in a respectable home in the northwest suburbs. The investigation would not reach him for decades. When it did, what they found beneath his floor would change the scale of what Chicago thought it knew. Section 3. John Wayne Gacy. In December 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men and boys at his home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, northwest of Chicago. He buried 26 of them in the crawl space beneath the floor of the house, covering successive burials with lime and eventually with concrete when the available ground became difficult to dig. 3 more were buried elsewhere on the same property. The last 4, killed after the crawl space had no usable space remaining, were dropped from a bridge over the Des Plaines River on Interstate 55 in the early hours of the morning. The house sat on a quiet residential street. Gacy held annual summer parties that the whole neighborhood attended. His second wife, who lived in the house until their divorce in 1976, noticed a persistent smell from the crawl space for years. He told her it was moisture backing up from a sewer pipe. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. He grew up on the North Side. His father was a machinist and, by most accounts of people who knew the family, a hard and critical man. Gacy married in 1964 and relocated to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. He was, in that period, a competent businessman, a joiner of local organizations, and someone who cultivated the social ease that comes from needing to be liked. In 1968, he was charged in Iowa with the sodomy of a teenage male employee. He pleaded guilty. The court sentenced him to 10 years at the Iowa State Reformatory. He served 18 months and was released on parole in June 1970. His wife divorced him during his imprisonment. When he was paroled, Iowa authorities did not notify the Illinois Parole Board of his conviction. He returned to Chicago with a clean slate in the jurisdiction he was moving back to. That administrative failure would matter. With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought the house on West Somerdale Avenue. He remodeled parts of it himself. In 1972, he married again, a childhood acquaintance named Carol Hoff, who moved into the house with her 2 daughters. In the same year, Gacy founded a contracting business he named PDM, which stood for Painting, Decorating, and Maintenance. The business grew steadily. By 1978, its annual turnover exceeded $200,000. PDM employed a rotating roster of young men, most of them in their teens or early 20s, most of them paid in cash, many of them not formally on any payroll. The work was legitimate. Gacy won municipal contracts. He was a capable organizer and an effective salesman. The business was also a source of victims, and Gacy understood both functions simultaneously for the entirety of its operation. His first known murder took place on January 3, 1972, at the house on West Somerdale Avenue. He had met a 16-year-old named Timothy McCoy at the Greyhound bus station in downtown Chicago. McCoy was passing through on his way home to Nebraska, waiting out a layover. Gacy offered him a place to stay for the night and drove him to the house. McCoy was stabbed to death before morning. Gacy buried the body in the crawl space and spread lime over the site. He would later tell investigators that after this first killing, he experienced something he described as a revelation about himself. He understood, he said, that taking a life had given him something he had not known before. He killed twice more by the end of 1975. After his second marriage ended in divorce in 1976, the pace increased sharply. In the 2 years between 1976 and his arrest in December 1978, he killed at least 30 victims. The method was consistent enough to have a name. Gacy described it to investigators with what they found to be a pride that was entirely unself-conscious. He called it the rope trick. He would produce a length of rope, tie it in a loop, and tell his victim he wanted to show them something. Once the loop was around the victim's neck, he would insert a stick into the knot and twist. The garrote tightened until the victim lost consciousness. He used handcuffs as a prelude, often framed as a magic trick, to restrain victims before they understood what was happening. He raped the men and boys before killing them. The bodies went into the crawl space, covered with lime. When a space became difficult to dig, he would pour concrete over previous burials to harden the ground before digging adjacent to it. By sometime in 1977, he had run out of usable space in the crawl space. His solution was practical in the same way everything else he did was practical. He began driving to the bridge over the Des Plaines River on Interstate 55, south of Chicago, and dropping bodies from it into the water. He told investigators later that he had disposed of 4 victims this way, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, sometimes in full daylight. The river ran steadily. The bodies moved with it. Meanwhile, on West Somerdale Avenue, John Wayne Gacy attended political fundraisers and was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter in 1978. He dressed as Pogo the Clown at children's birthday parties, neighborhood events, and hospital visits. He served as a Democratic Party precinct captain. He knew politicians, police officers, and contractors across the northwest side of Cook County. He held annual summer parties at the house that the whole block attended. Nobody who came to those parties found anything to report. The investigation that ended his freedom began not with any of his 33 victims, but with the 33rd. Robert P. Est was 15 years old and worked part-time at the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. On the evening of December 11, 1978, his mother came to pick him up after her birthday celebration, and Robert told her he would be back in a few minutes because he wanted to speak with a contractor who had come into the pharmacy about a possible summer job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert P.S. did not come back. His mother waited. When he did not appear, she reported him missing to the Des Plaines Police Department that same night. The investigation moved quickly from that point because, for once, there was a clear last-seen account and a named last contact. Detectives spoke to pharmacy staff, who confirmed Gacy's presence. They ran Gacy's name and found the 1968 Iowa conviction. They obtained a search warrant for his home. On the first search, Officers entering the house noticed what one of them described as an odor consistent with decomposition rising from the area of the crawl space when the furnace activated. They found items at the property, including a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Piest worked, that placed Gacy in direct connection with the missing teenager. Gacy told police he knew nothing about the boy's disappearance. He was placed under continuous surveillance. Over the following days, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He contacted lawyers. He moved between locations at odd hours with police in his wake. On December 21, officers arrested him after observing him hand a bag of marijuana to a gas station attendant, giving them grounds to detain him. That same evening, investigators executed a second search warrant and began excavating the crawl space. The first remains were located that night. On December 22nd, Gacy's attorney drove him to the Des Plaines Police Department, where Gacy told investigators in a rambling statement that he had killed more than 30 young men and boys, had buried most of them on his property, and had thrown the last 4 into the Des Plaines River. He then produced, without being asked, a hand-drawn diagram showing where in the crawl space the bodies were positioned. The diagram was, investigators would later confirm, remarkably accurate. The excavation of the property took weeks. 26 bodies were recovered from the crawl space. 3 more were found elsewhere on the property, one beneath the garage floor, others in the yard. The bodies had been there, in some cases, for years. Several had been buried on top of previous victims. The combined smell had been present in the neighborhood for long enough that multiple neighbors had noticed it and accepted Gacy's explanation without pursuing it further. The house was demolished in April 1979, 4 months after his arrest. A new structure was eventually built on the same plot in 1986. The address was changed. Gacy was indicted on 33 counts of murder. His trial opened on February 6, 1980, at the Cook County Criminal Court in Chicago. The defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, presenting testimony from psychiatrists who argued Gacy suffered from a form of multiple personality disorder. The prosecution countered with its own psychiatric testimony establishing that Gacy had understood what he was doing and had consistently acted to conceal it. The jury was drawn from Winnebago County and relocated to Cook County for the duration of proceedings, a mechanism used in Illinois for the first time in this case. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by William Kunkel, included a moment that became one of the most discussed in Illinois courtroom history. Kunkel removed photographs of each of Gacy's known victims one by one from a display board as he spoke about them, then dropped the photographs through the opening of a replica crawl-space trapdoor that had been constructed as a courtroom exhibit. The pictures scattered across the floor of the jury box. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 50 minutes. On March 12, 1980, Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder, a number that at the time represented the highest murder conviction total against a single defendant in American history. The following day, the jury returned the sentence. Illinois had reinstated capital punishment in 1977, meaning only the 12 murders demonstrably committed after that date were eligible for a death sentence. Gacy received death for those 12 and natural life for the remaining 21. Judge Louis Garippo, in thanking the jury after the verdict, noted that whatever the cost of the proceedings had been, it was a small price for what had been accomplished. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, filing appeal after appeal. Every appeal failed. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Penitentiary on May 10, 1994. He was 52 years old. 5 of his 33 victims remain unidentified. Cook County investigators reopened the identification effort in 2011 using DNA analysis unavailable at the time the bodies were recovered, and further identifications have been made since. The house on West Summerdale Avenue no longer exists, and the street number has been retired from the city's records. The crawl space that held 26 people over a period of 6 years is gone entirely. What was below the floor of that ordinary ranch house in an ordinary northwest suburb is not something the neighborhood has found a way to absorb, and probably should not have to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 33 victims, 1 address, 6 years of burial beneath an ordinary floor. The next case on this list reaches further back than any of the others covered so far, into the mid-1940s, when a 17-year-old student at the University of Chicago was arrested for 3 murders and a message written in lipstick on a wall. He would become Illinois' longest-serving prisoner. Whether he was guilty is a question that was never cleanly resolved. Section 4. William Herons. 3 murders between June 1945 and January 1946 produced a level of fear in Chicago that city newspapers would later estimate affected more people more acutely than any crime in the city's recent history. On June 5, 1945, 43-year-old Josephine Ross was found repeatedly stabbed in her apartment at 4108 North Kenmore Avenue, her head wrapped in a dress, dark hairs clenched in her fist from a struggle no one outside the room heard. In December, Frances Brown was found at 3941 North Pine Grove Avenue, a knife lodged in her neck and a bullet wound to her head, and the killer had stayed long enough afterward to take her lipstick and write a 10-word message on the wall. On January 7, 1946, 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan was taken through her bedroom window in Edgewater, strangled, dismembered in the basement of a nearby building, and her remains distributed through the storm drains of the surrounding streets. A 17-year-old University of Chicago student named William Herons was arrested in June 1946 during an unrelated burglary, and the city's investigation moved toward him with a speed that the courts would later describe as a flagrant violation of his rights. 6 months later, on December 10, 1945, a cleaning woman at an apartment building on North Pine Grove Avenue heard a radio playing loudly through a partly open door and found the body of Frances Brown, a 33-year-old divorced woman, in the position she would eventually become famous for. She was draped across the edge of the bathtub, a knife lodged in her neck, a bullet wound to her head. Her killer, before leaving, had taken her lipstick and written on the wall of the apartment in capital letters, some larger than others, with irregular emphasis, "For heathens' sake, catch me before I kill more, I sell, control myself." That message, 10 words in irregular capitals on a dead woman's apartment wall, was what gave the case its name and changed the temperature of the city. The press had it within hours. By the following morning, the lipstick killer was a headline across every one of Chicago's 5 daily newspapers. The fear that followed was not small. It became something worse on January 7, 1946. Suzanne Degnan was 6 years old and lived with her family in the Edgewater neighborhood on the north side. On the night of January 7th, someone placed a ladder against the side of the Degnan home, climbed to her first-floor bedroom window, and took her from her bed without waking her parents. A ransom note was found on the bedroom floor. It demanded $20,000 in $5 and $10 bills, and instructed the family not to contact the FBI or the police. The Degnans reported the abduction immediately. The search began within the hour. Suzanne Degnan's body was found in pieces in the storm drains and catch basins of the surrounding blocks. Her head, her hair still tied with a blue ribbon, was recovered from a sewer opening. Her right leg was found in a catch basin. Her torso was located in another sewer a short distance away. She had been strangled and then dismembered in the basement of a nearby building using a laundry tub. The ransom note had never been intended to lead anywhere. The murder had already happened before it was left. The city reacted with something close to collective panic. Police received thousands of tips. Over 375 people were questioned in connection with the Degnan case alone in the weeks that followed. The combination of the 2 apartment murders, the lipstick message, and now the abduction and dismemberment of a child produced a public demand for resolution that was, by any measure, difficult to withstand. The investigation was enormous and under permanent pressure, and it had, after 6 months, produced no arrest. William George Herons was born on November 15, 1928, in Evanston, Illinois. He grew up in Lincolnwood, a suburb just north of the Chicago city limits. His family was poor, his parents fought constantly, and Herons spent much of his childhood on the streets to avoid the noise inside the house. He had begun stealing from an early age, working alone, breaking into houses and apartments as a teenager, taking small items. By the time he was 16, he had been caught twice for burglary and sent twice to a reform institution. Both times he was released. Both times he resumed. By 1946, he was 17 years old. enrolled as a student in the College of the University of Chicago, and still committing burglaries on the side with enough regularity that his activities in the neighborhoods around the university had attracted some attention. He was, on the surface, a quiet and unremarkable young man pursuing a degree. He was also, beneath that surface, conducting a habitual and escalating criminal operation that had, by his own later accounting, involved over 300 separate break-ins. On June 26, 1946, Herons was cornered by police during an attempted burglary in the Rogers Park neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. He was armed. During the arrest, an off-duty police officer dropped clay flower pots from above to subdue him. Herons was struck in the head and lost consciousness. He was taken first to a hospital where his skull fracture was treated, and then transferred to Bridewell Hospital, adjacent to the Cook County Jail, where he was strapped to a hospital bed and held. While he was hospitalized and unable to give consent, police searched his student accommodation. They found a suitcase containing stolen property. They also found that his fingerprints, on file from his earlier arrests, matched a partial print lifted from the ransom note found in Suzanne Degnan's bedroom. That match, announced publicly within days, transformed the investigation. The state's attorney's office moved to charge Herons with the Degnan murder and, by extension, with the killings of Josephine Ross and Frances Brown. The question of how to secure a confession was approached in a manner that the Illinois Supreme Court would later describe, in terms that remained on record, as flagrant violations of his rights. Herons was interrogated without a lawyer present. His parents were not permitted access. He was questioned across multiple sessions over days while bedridden. When he continued to deny involvement, the state's attorney authorized an injection of sodium pentothal, a barbiturate used at the time as a so-called truth serum and administered without Herons's consent and against the advice of hospital physicians. He was also subjected to a lie detector test and a spinal tap, the latter performed without anesthetic. He was held in these conditions for 42 days before a formal confession was produced. Under the influence of sodium pentothal, Herons spoke about the crimes in a dissociated way, attributing them to an alter ego he called George. This persona, Herons said in the drug-induced session, was the one who had done the things he was being asked about. The state's attorney's office interpreted this as an indirect admission of guilt. On August 7, 1946, 42 days into his custody, Herons provided a signed written confession to the 3 murders and to over 300 burglaries. His lawyers then advised him that proceeding to trial would almost certainly result in a death sentence in the electric chair, given the state of public opinion and the weight of evidence that would be presented. They told him that a guilty plea would spare his life. On September 4, 1946, Herons pleaded guilty to all 3 murders. He received 3 consecutive terms of natural life imprisonment. He was 17 years old. He would later summarize his position in a single sentence that stayed with the case for the rest of his life. He said he had confessed to live. The sentence was a fact. What remained contested for 65 years was whether the fact was just. Herons recanted his confession in the years after sentencing and maintained his innocence for the remainder of his imprisonment. The arguments his supporters advanced were specific. The handwriting analysis that identified the lipstick message as his was disputed by independent experts who examined the same materials and reached different conclusions. The fingerprint evidence linking him to the Degnan ransom note was, his advocates argued, procedurally compromised by the conditions of its collection and handling. The dismemberment of Suzanne Degnan had been carried out with a degree of anatomical precision that some forensic examiners believed required either medical training or significant experience, and Herons had neither. The items that investigators claimed were surgical tools found in his possession were identified by others as components of model aircraft kits. No blood was recovered from his clothing or his accommodation despite the nature of the crimes. The confession itself had been produced under conditions that the state's own highest court had explicitly characterized as unlawful. What the Illinois Supreme Court did not do, in its 1953 review of his case, was find that the unlawful conditions had caused the guilty plea in a legally sufficient sense. The court condemned the interrogation methods in strong language and declined to act on them. Herons's lawyers in subsequent decades argued that this reasoning was circular. A confession extracted through illegal means produced a guilty plea entered to avoid execution, and the court's refusal to examine the causal relationship between the two left the original conviction untouched, regardless of how it had been obtained. That argument was made before the parole board approximately 30 times over 6 decades. Each time it was rejected. The prison years were not without their own account. Herons was the first inmate in the history of the Illinois Department of Corrections to earn a 4-year college degree while incarcerated. He tutored other prisoners. He worked in the prison hospital. He conducted himself, by all institutional measures, as a model prisoner for the entirety of a sentence that ran longer than the lives of most of the people who had originally called for his execution. By 2009, when a CNN journalist found him in a wheelchair at Dixon Correctional Center, he had been imprisoned for 63 years, a number that exceeded the full lifespan of everyone who had died in the 3 murders he was convicted of committing. He was 80 years old and still applying for parole. He still had nightmares, friends who visited him said, though it was not clear about what. The sister of Josephine Ross, the first victim, was consistent and direct whenever the question was raised. She said he had been the bogeyman, and that nobody needed to feel sorry for him. She said that after his arrest, the horrible crimes had stopped, and that this alone was sufficient. She had spent decades opposing his parole applications, and she continued to do so until the question became moot. It became moot on March 5, 2012, when Herons was found unresponsive at Dixon Correctional Center. He was transferred to the University of Illinois Medical Center in Chicago, where he was pronounced dead. The cause was complications of diabetes. He was 83 years old. He had served 65 years in Illinois state custody, more than any other prisoner in the state's history. The record stands. The case sits in an uncomfortable position in the record of Chicago crime, because it refuses to close cleanly. 3 people died in 1945 and 1946 in ways that were, by any measure, brutal. A child was dismembered and her body distributed in sections through the storm drains of her own neighborhood. A message in lipstick was written on a dead woman's wall. Those facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the 17-year-old student who confessed under sodium pentothal after 42 days in unlawful custody was the person who did those things, or whether the city's need for the case to be solved, under the pressure of 5 competing newspapers and a public demanding an answer, produced a solution that was something other than the truth. The Illinois courts examined that question and declined to reopen it. William Herons went to his grave maintaining he had not done it. The victims' families maintained he had. Nobody has found a way to resolve the space between those two positions, and nobody now is likely to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 65 years in a cell for crimes that may or may not have happened the way the confession said. The next figure on this list operated as a group rather than alone, and the crimes they committed in the early 1980s on the streets of the Chicago suburbs were driven not just by violence, but by something that made the investigation harder to understand and the convictions harder to predict. 4 men, a red van, a satanic chapel in an attic. Section 5. Robin Gecht and the Ripper Crew. On June 1, 1981, police responding to a report of a smell near the Rip Van Winkle Motel in Villa Park, a suburb west of Chicago, found the body of 28-year-old Linda Sutton in a field behind the building. She had been handcuffed. Her left breast had been surgically removed. The condition of the body, the degree of decomposition, and the precision of the wound were sufficient for investigators to establish that what had been done to her was deliberate, specific, and carried out by someone who had done it before or intended to do it again. There were no witnesses and nothing at the scene pointing to a particular person. A year passed before the next confirmed victim disappeared. By the time the group responsible was identified in the autumn of 1982, 6 women were confirmed dead across Cook and DuPage counties, and investigators were dealing with a category of crime the Chicago Police Department had no immediate framework to process. Robin Gecht was born on November 30, 1953, in Menard, Illinois. By 1981, he was 27 years old, married, the father of 3 children, and working as a freelance carpenter taking contracts across the northwest suburbs of Chicago. He was, to anyone who encountered him professionally, an ordinary tradesman. He had one connection to the broader criminal history of the city that investigators would note later, with a particular kind of attention. In the late 1970s, he had worked as a subcontractor for PDM Contractors, the construction business run by John Wayne Gacy out of Norwood Park Township. The nature of the relationship between the two men beyond that professional connection has never been established in any detail. What the connection established was something more structural, that Gecht had access to the same networks of young and often transient workers that Gacy had used, and that the world of freelance suburban construction in Cook County was small enough that these men knew each other. Gecht's three associates were Edward Spreitzer, born in Chicago in January 1961, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorelis, both from Villa Park. Andrew was born in July 1963. Thomas was born in July 1960. They were young men, all of them in their late teens or early 20s when the crimes began, and they had been drawn into Gecht's orbit through a combination of personal connection and something that his accomplices would later describe, in confessions and testimony, as a framework of belief that Gecht had constructed and enforced. That framework centered on a makeshift chapel Gecht had built in the attic of his home at 2163 North McVicker Avenue in Chicago. The chapel contained an altar. Gecht used it to conduct rituals drawn from the Satanic Bible and from his own elaborations on what that text permitted and required. The four men drove a reddish-orange 1975 Dodge van through the streets of Chicago and the surrounding suburbs at night, looking for women who were alone and appeared vulnerable. Women were abducted off sidewalks. They were offered rides and then restrained once inside the vehicle. They were driven to remote locations, to fields and cemeteries in the van itself, and subjected to assault over extended periods. The mutilation that was inflicted on the victims was consistent across the attacks. The left breast was targeted with cutting instruments. In the cases where victims were killed, the wound was the cause of death by blood loss or was inflicted post-mortem. What happened to the removed flesh, according to the confessions of Spreitzer and both Kokorali's brothers, was that it was brought back to Gecht's attic chapel and used as part of a ritual he presided over. Gecht would read from the Satanic Bible. The tissue was used in a communion-style ceremony. Thomas Kokorelis told investigators that he had once seen a box in the attic containing 15 such preserved trophies. The crimes had a pattern that investigation later reconstructed with reasonable precision. The year-long gap between Linda Sutton's murder in May 1981 and the next confirmed attack in May 1982 may reflect crimes committed in that interval that were not identified as part of the same series, or it may reflect a genuine pause. What is established is that from May 1982, the pace accelerated sharply. On May 15th of that year, 21-year-old Lorraine Borowski arrived at the Elmhurst real estate office where she worked as a receptionist and was due to open the building for the day. She did not open it. When other employees arrived, they found the office door still locked and, scattered on the pavement outside, Borowski's shoes, her handbag, and its contents. She had been taken from the pavement in front of her workplace in what must have been a matter of minutes. Her body was recovered 5 months later, on October 10, 1982, in a cemetery in Clarendon Hills. The body was too decomposed by that point for a cause of death to be established with certainty. 2 weeks after Borowski's disappearance, on May 29th, the group abducted a 30-year-old Chinese immigrant named Shui Mak, who had been left stranded at the side of a road following a family dispute. Her body was found 4 months later. In June 1982, a young woman named Angel York was picked up by the van. 4 men restrained her, slashed her breast open, and then pushed her from the vehicle while it was still moving. She survived. The wounds she described, and the wounds that medical examination confirmed, matched exactly the injuries found on the women who had not survived. Her account gave investigators their first survivor testimony describing the group's method in clinical detail. The information she provided did not, at that stage, lead to immediate arrests. The case broke on October 6, 1982, on a road near a Chicago railway line. Beverly Washington was 30 years old. She accepted a ride from a reddish-orange van. Once inside, Gecht gave her pills and, as they took effect and she lost consciousness, assaulted and mutilated her. She was found alive near the railroad track on December 6, 1982, beaten, her left breast amputated, having survived by what was physiologically a narrow margin. She was hospitalized in serious condition. She was able to describe the van, the man who had offered the ride, and enough of what had happened to give investigators a usable account. On October 20th, 1982, police arrested Gecht and charged him with the assault on Beverly, Washington. He was also suspected of a similar attack on a woman named Cynthia Smith, who had escaped from his van. Investigators immediately connected him to the Ripper murder series, but the evidentiary threshold for a murder charge was not met at that stage. Gecht posted bond on October 26th and was released. He remained at liberty while the investigation continued. What investigators found next came from the motel. Detectives looking into Gecht's background discovered that he and 3 associates had rented adjoining rooms at the Rip Van Winkle Motel in Villa Park some months before Linda Sutton's body had been found in the field directly behind it. The motel manager, when questioned, described the 4 men as frequent visitors who brought women to the rooms regularly and who gave the impression of being involved in some kind of organized cult activity. 2 of the men the manager described were Thomas and Andrew Kokorelis, brothers from Villa Park who had grown up less than a mile from the motel. This gave investigators a direct connection between the group and the first confirmed murder site. Edward Spreitzer was arrested on November 5, 1982. The Kokorelis brothers followed. Spreitzer, once in custody, confessed at length and named the others. Both Kokorelis brothers also provided confessions. They described the attic chapel, the rituals, the van, and the sequence of victims. They told investigators they had killed up to 20 women. The confirmed number that prosecutors were able to build charges around was substantially lower. The 4 cases produced 4 very different outcomes, and the divergence between them became its own commentary on how group criminal prosecutions operate when the evidence against each individual member is not equal. Robin Gecht, the man all 3 of his associates identified as the leader and the architect of the rituals, was never charged with any murder. The evidence directly linking him to a specific killing was insufficient for prosecution. In 1983, he was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assault, and rape arising from the attack on Beverly, Washington. On February 17, 1984, he was sentenced to 120 years in prison. His projected parole date is October 2042. He is currently held at Danville Correctional Center. He maintains his innocence. Edward Spreitzer, who had confessed in detail and whose cooperation had helped build the cases against the others, was nonetheless sentenced to death for his role in the murders. His death sentence was commuted to life without parole by Governor George Ryan in January 2003, when Ryan cleared the entire Illinois death row in one of the final acts of his administration before leaving office under federal corruption charges. Spreitzer remains in prison. Thomas Kokorelis was convicted of the murder of Lorraine Borowski and sentenced to life in prison. His original conviction was subsequently overturned on a procedural ground related to how evidence had been handled at trial. He pleaded guilty again in a second proceeding and was resentenced to 70 years. Under Illinois sentencing provisions in force at the time of his sentence, he was entitled to 1 day of good time credit for every day served, effectively halving the term. He was released on parole in March 1999, having served 35 years. He was subsequently relocated to a ministry in Peoria and required to check in quarterly with the Peoria Police Department. Andrew Kokorelis was convicted of the murder of Lorraine Borowski and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on March 17, 1999, at the Tams Correctional Center. He was 35 years old. He was the last person to be executed in Illinois before Governor George Ryan imposed a moratorium on capital punishment in the state. Ryan had authorized Andrew's execution 6 weeks before imposing the moratorium. The decision and its timing became central to the debate that eventually led to the complete abolition of the death penalty in Illinois in 2011. Andrew Kokorelis is the last person the state of Illinois has put to death. Whether that distinction will remain permanent is not settled. The Ripper Crew case sits awkwardly in the public record because its most prominent figure, the man the others unanimously identified as their leader, was convicted of no murder and will be eligible for parole before he is 90 years old. The crimes were not disputed. The attic chapel was real. When police searched Gecht's home on North McVicker Avenue, they found blood-stained knives and instruments in the attic space his associates had described. The question of what the law could prove against each individual, given the rules of evidence as they applied in the early 1980s, produced outcomes that survivors and victims' families found inadequate. That inadequacy is part of the record too. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A group operating from a van, a leader who avoided a murder conviction entirely, and an execution that closed one chapter while opening another around the death penalty itself. The next figure on this list was working alone, and his method was the highway. 21 young men along the interstate routes of Illinois and Indiana, and a legal system that caught him once and let him go. Section 6. Larry Eyler. Between October 1982 and August 1984, the bodies of at least 21 young men were found along the interstate highway routes of Illinois and Indiana, in drainage ditches beside the carriageway, in cornfields running back from rural county roads, and at one abandoned farm in Newton County, Indiana, where 4 bodies were recovered from a single site in October 1983. The victims were always young, always male, their clothing always disturbed in the same specific way, their torsos always carrying multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. In September 1983, a traffic stop on an Indiana interstate produced a suspect named Larry Eyler sitting in a Ford pickup alongside rope, handcuffs, a hammer, 2 baseball bats, a mallet, and surgical tape. A subsequent search found a knife whose blood a forensic laboratory matched to a murder victim. A judge ruled the stop unconstitutional. The evidence was suppressed. Eyler was released in February 1984. He moved to Chicago 6 months later, and Daniel Bridges was found in a dumpster in Rogers Park 6 months after that. Larry William Eyler was born in Crawfordsville, Indiana, on December 21, 1952. He was the youngest of 4 children. His parents divorced when he was 3, and he was raised in circumstances that involved, by multiple accounts, repeated exposure to physical violence from a series of stepfathers. He grew up with an understanding of himself as gay that he found difficult to integrate with the broader expectations of the social world around him in the 1960s and early 1970s, and that conflict persisted into his adult life as something investigators and those who knew him later described as a concentrated, poorly directed rage. He had no formal criminal record for violence in adulthood beyond a 1978 incident in which he stabbed a young man named Craig Long during what began as a sexual proposition. Long survived. Eyler pleaded guilty and was fined $43. No custodial sentence followed. By the time the murders began in late 1982, Eyler had established a routine that distributed him across 2 states in a way that made his movements difficult to track. During the week, he worked as a house painter across northern Illinois, taking residential and commercial contracts. On weekends, he stayed at the Terre Haute, Indiana residence of a man named Robert Little, a professor at Indiana State University, with whom he had a relationship. He also worked part-time at a liquor store in Greencastle, Indiana, on Saturdays. The regular back and forth between states provided him with 2 distinct geographic pools in which to operate, 2 separate sets of investigators who would not immediately connect his activity in one jurisdiction to his activity in the other, and a Ford pickup truck that covered the distance between them on routes that ran, consistently, along the interstate highway corridors where his victims were found. The method was consistent. He picked up young men, typically teenagers and men in their early 20s, from the areas around gay bars, from hitchhiking spots along major roads, and from streets in Chicago's North Side neighborhoods where young men engaged in sex work. He drove them to remote locations, farm tracks, rural roads, isolated stretches of embankment. He restrained them with rope or handcuffs. He subjected them to sexual violence. He stabbed them repeatedly, with wounds concentrated on the chest and torso. He left them where they fell, their clothing pulled down, their wallets and shirts frequently taken. The abandonment was rapid. He was back on the road before most of the bodies were found. In May 1983, police agencies from Indiana assembled in Indianapolis to share information on a series of murders that none of them had been able to connect formally to a single subject. The meeting produced a formal structure, the Central Indiana Multi-Agency Investigative Team, with officers drawn from multiple county and state jurisdictions. A month later, 50 officers from 8 agencies gathered to review a combined list of unsolved murders involving young men stabbed and left near highways across the state. The task force began working toward a common suspect profile. By June 1983, a tip had come in naming Larry Eyler. The source told investigators that Eyler had once been charged with stabbing a hitchhiker in 1978, that he was known in certain communities as someone who was violent during sexual encounters, and that he had on a previous occasion drugged a 14-year-old boy and abandoned him in Woodland. The task force placed Eyler under surveillance. On September 30, 1983, Indiana State Police Trooper Kenneth Burley pulled over a vehicle parked illegally on the interstate. The driver was Eyler. A young man was in the passenger seat. Both were briefly arrested on suspicion of soliciting for sex. Eyler's truck was searched while he was held. In it, investigators found rope, handcuffs, a hammer, 2 baseball bats, a mallet, and surgical tape. The items were seized. Eyler was held while the task force was notified, and officers from Indiana and Illinois traveled to the scene, some from Lake County, Illinois, who subsequently searched a property connected to Eyler without a separate warrant. FBI laboratory analysis of a knife and boots seized in the searches identified blood that matched that of a murder victim named Ralph Calisi. In late October 1983, Eyler was formally arrested in Lake County, Illinois, and charged with Calisi's murder. The case against him did not hold. His defense attorney, David Shippers, filed a motion in December 1983 to suppress all evidence gathered in the searches conducted after the September 30 traffic stop, and all statements Eyler had made in connection with that stop and its aftermath. A suppression hearing convened in Lake County in January 1984. Testimony over 4 days established that Eyler had committed no offense beyond illegal parking at the moment of the initial stop, and that the sole reason police had prolonged his detention beyond that was to allow the task force time to arrive, a purpose that bore no legal relationship to the stated grounds for the stop. It further emerged that the search of the associated property by Lake County officers had been conducted without a warrant. Judge William Block found that the constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure had been violated. All evidence gathered from the searches, the rope, the handcuffs, the knife, the boots, the tire prints, was suppressed. Without it, there was no case. On February 6, 1984, Larry Eyler was released from custody. Investigators in both Illinois and Indiana had, at that stage, traced his movements across a full year of activity, and believed they could place him at the scenes of 21 murders. They had no evidence they were legally permitted to use in court. They released him, and they watched him. Robert Little, the Indiana professor, paid for an apartment in the Rogers Park neighborhood on Chicago's far north side. 4 weeks after his release, Eyler relocated there permanently. He resumed work as a house painter. The killings, which had paused during his months in custody, did not resume immediately. By the summer of 1984, investigators in both states believed he was active again, but had not yet produced a case they could bring. On the morning of August 21, 1984, a building janitor named Joseph Balla went to a dumpster in the alley behind an apartment complex in Rogers Park to dispose of rubbish. He found 6 black plastic garbage bags. He opened one. He contacted police. The bags contained the dismembered body of a 16-year-old named Daniel Bridges, cut into 8 pieces, each one completely drained of blood before being bagged and placed in the dumpster. Daniel Bridges was from the neighborhood. He was a habitual runaway who had been working as a male prostitute since early adolescence. He had known Eyler. 2 months earlier, he had described Eyler to a journalist working on a documentary about child exploitation in Chicago as, in his exact words, a real freak. Police traced the dumpster to the apartment complex and the apartment to Eyler. They went to the building. Eyler was inside with Robert Little. Blood found in the apartment matched Daniel Bridges. Eyler was arrested and charged with murder, aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and concealment of a homicidal death. His trial opened in Cook County in July 1986. The evidence was overwhelming in the specific case of Daniel Bridges. The apartment, the blood, the dumpster, the testimony about Eyler's relationship with the victim. Eyler was convicted. On October 3, 1986, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection by Judge Joseph Urso. He was additionally convicted of a murder in Indiana in a separate proceeding and received a 60-year sentence, handed down on December 28, 1990. The Indiana sentence ran alongside the Illinois death sentence without affecting its primacy. From death row at Pontiac Correctional Center, Eiler made an approach through his attorney, Kathleen Zellner, to Cook County State's Attorney Jack O'Malley. He offered to confess to 20 or more unsolved murders across the Midwest in exchange for commutation of his death sentence to life without parole. O'Malley declined. The offer lapsed. What Eiler told Zellner in the absence of any deal he eventually told her with the instruction that she release it only after his death. He signed a written confession to 21 murders. He also, while still alive, confessed to investigators to the 1982 murder of 23-year-old Stephen Agan in Indiana, in circumstances where a confession served a limited practical purpose for him, but allowed Agan's family to have an answer. The death sentence was never carried out. On March 6, 1994, Larry Eiler died at Pontiac Correctional Center of complications related to AIDS. He was 41 years old. An appeal of his Illinois conviction was pending in the Illinois Supreme Court at the time of his death. Zellner released the full confession following the formal announcement of his death. It named 21 victims, identified locations, and provided details that allowed investigators to close a number of cold cases. It also contained a claim, which Eiler had made earlier and which investigators had not accepted, that Robert Little had been physically responsible for 5 of the murders, including that of Daniel Bridges, and that Eiler's own attorney, David Shippers, had received payments from Little while representing Eiler at trial. What the suppression ruling in January 1984 cost is not a calculable number, but investigators who worked the case were not cautious about expressing what they believed. The task force had traced him to 21 murders. They had him in custody with physical evidence connecting him to the victims. A judge found that the detention had been conducted improperly, and the evidence gathered in connection with it was therefore inadmissible. He was released. The murders had stopped during the months he was held. They did not resume at the same rate after his release, but Daniel Bridges was found in August 1984 in 8 pieces in a dumpster in Rogers Park. The connection between the constitutional ruling and that outcome was not legal. It was simply chronological. Eiler was released. He moved to an apartment in Rogers Park. A 16-year-old who lived nearby was dead 6 months later. The interstate routes between Chicago and Indianapolis have a long, flat horizon, and you can see a considerable distance in most directions. The bodies stopped appearing there in August 1984. They had been appearing since October 1982. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 21 murders across 2 states, released on a warrant technicality, and dead on death row before the sentence could be carried out. The next case on this list moves to a single Chicago neighborhood and a single decade, where an investigator would later say the same area produced more serial killers per square mile than anywhere else in the country. A man who killed 11 women in Englewood over 6 years, and a DNA database that finally put a name to what had been happening in those streets. Section 7. Andre Crawford. In June 1999, 11 women were killed in the Englewood neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Their bodies left in the interiors of abandoned buildings across an area of roughly 12 square blocks. All 11 were lured there by the same man, who offered crack cocaine in exchange for sex and strangled or beat them to death once inside. He took their shoes each time. A DNA profile recovered from multiple crime scenes linked every killing to a single unidentified male, but identifying that male took 7 years, partly because 2 other men were killing women in the same neighborhood using the same method during overlapping periods, producing a forensic landscape so congested that at least one innocent man was convicted of a murder the right man had committed, and partly because the database capable of returning a genetic match did not yet exist in a functional form when the first woman died. Andre Crawford was born in Chicago on March 20, 1962. His father left the family shortly after his birth and played no further role in his life. His mother was prosecuted in the late 1960s for neglect, and Crawford and his sister were placed in foster care in a household with 4 other children. He later described the foster placement as involving regular beatings from the foster parents and sexual abuse within the household. He did not finish high school. He did not hold steady employment as an adult. By his 30s, he was addicted to crack cocaine, living in Englewood, and known in the neighborhood as someone who would do small, odd jobs for cash and who could be found most days on the same streets. Residents who were asked about him after his arrest used the same phrase repeatedly. They would never have expected it. He presented as an ordinary presence in a neighborhood that had many ordinary presences and very little institutional attention paid to any of them. His method was built on a transaction that was itself a feature of the neighborhood's economy in those years. He offered crack cocaine to women in exchange for sex. The offer was specific enough to attract women whose addiction made the exchange rational in the narrow sense, and who had no particular reason to view Crawford as a threat. He knew many of them by name. Some were casual acquaintances. He would lead them to one of the abandoned buildings, where the transaction would proceed along the lines he had described until it did not. When women resisted having sex before the cocaine was delivered, Crawford strangled them. When they did not resist, he strangled them afterward. He left the bodies where they fell, in the dark interiors of buildings that were not inspected regularly and not watched by anyone. He would return to the bodies later. He took the shoes from each victim before he left. The shoes were a consistent element that investigators noted but could not immediately explain. 11 women found strangled in abandoned buildings across the same neighborhood over 6 years, all of them missing their footwear. The pattern was there from the first discovery. On September 23, 1993, a building inspector monitoring a derelict property on Chicago's South Side found a woman's body on a loading dock. She was naked from the waist down. Her face had been beaten with considerable force and was covered with a cloth. Her shoes were gone. Chicago Police Tactical Officer Anthony Flowers, who attended the scene, noted the missing shoes as an element worth recording. The detail went into the file. It would not connect to a name for 7 more years. What made the investigation additionally complex, in a way that had consequences for people beyond the 11 murder victims, was that Crawford was not the only person killing women in Englewood during this period. Hubert Gerolds, a 30-year-old man who had moved to Chicago from New York, killed 5 women in the same neighborhood between December 1994 and June 1995, using strangulation as his method and leaving bodies in similarly concealed locations. Gregory Klepper was suspected by investigators of killing 14 women in the broader South Side area between 1991 and 1996. At one point in 1995, according to investigators who later reviewed the case geography, 3 separate killers were operating within approximately 12 blocks of each other in the southern section of Englewood. The victims of each overlapped in profile, in method, and in geography. The investigations overlapped as well, producing a situation in which a murder that belonged to one man was attributed to another, and an innocent man was convicted of a killing he had not committed. Derek Flewellen was convicted of one of Crawford's murders in 1995. The investigation had identified him as a suspect in several Englewood killings, and a confession was obtained. Later analysis established that the confession had been coerced, and that Flewellen had not committed the murder in question. The charges against him were dropped in November 1999, after Crawford's DNA had begun to answer questions that the investigation had previously resolved through other, more fragile means. Hubert Gerolds similarly confessed to a murder that DNA subsequently reassigned to Crawford. The forensic reattribution of those cases, once Crawford's genetic profile was in the system, retrospectively dismantled attribution decisions that had been made under investigative pressure in an area where multiple killers were producing similar evidence in similar locations. Crawford himself had been arrested twice in the years before the DNA link was established. In May 1995, he was charged with assault and rape. The victim, whose testimony was the primary evidence, declined to cooperate with investigators. Her reluctance was attributed in part to her drug dependency. The charges were dropped, and Crawford was released after spending more than a year in the Cook County Jail awaiting the outcome. In November 1999, he was arrested again on a felony drug possession charge. Crawford was brought in for questioning on the unrelated drug matter. He agreed to provide a DNA sample. The sample was run through the database. It matched the profile from 7 murder scenes. He was formally arrested on January 28, 2000. In the interrogation room, he was told what the DNA had established. He sat with this information for a short period, and then, over the course of 3 days of videotaped questioning, told investigators everything. The confession was comprehensive. He described each of the 7 murders the DNA had linked him to, and then described 3 additional killings that investigators had not connected to him. The extra 3 involved women who matched the same victim profile, from the same neighborhood, in the same time period, who had not been grouped with the main series. He described where he had taken each woman. He described the abandoned buildings. He described the shoes. His manner throughout the confession, according to investigators and prosecutors who reviewed the recordings, was flat and composed in a way that they found difficult to characterize as anything except the absence of distress about what he was describing. Claudia Robinson had survived the attack on Thanksgiving night of 1997. She was 42 years old and had been walking in the neighborhood when Crawford forced her into an abandoned building, raped her, and beat her severely. He threw a mattress over her body and took her shoes. She lay still underneath the mattress, not moving, until he left. She was the 12th woman he attacked, and the only one who lived to describe him. Her account was detailed enough to produce a composite sketch. The sketch was distributed in the neighborhood. Someone who recognized it contacted police in January 2000. That tip was what brought Crawford in on the drug charge, which led to the DNA sample, which closed the case. Robinson's decision to stay completely still under a mattress in the dark of an abandoned Englewood building in 1997 was the chain of events that ended the series. Crawford spent 10 years in the Cook County Jail awaiting trial, while his defense attorneys challenged aspects of the evidence. The trial finally commenced in November 2009, more than 16 years after the first murder. The jury took 10 hours to find him guilty on all counts. The judge read the word guilty 24 times, once for each of the primary charges relating to murder and aggravated sexual assault, plus the attempted murder of Claudia Robinson. Crawford's reaction in the courtroom as the verdicts were read was described by the brother of one victim as a sinister smile. Derek Cotton, whose sister Cheryl Cross had been killed, said he saw it from where he was sitting in the gallery. The jury then considered the question of the death penalty. Crawford was eligible. Illinois law required that the jury be unanimous to impose it, and the jury was not unanimous. On December 17, 2009, Judge Evelyn Clay sentenced Andre Crawford to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families of the victims did not find this adequate. The sister of Patricia Dunn, Rena Carlock, put the calculation plainly. She said that 2 killings made a defendant eligible for death, and Crawford had committed 11, and she wanted to know what kind of justice that represented. Claudia Robinson, who had survived by playing dead for long enough that he believed she was, wept in the courthouse and said that the verdict sent a message to every criminal that they could kill and live. Cook County State's Attorney Jim McKay said in response that someone who had brutalized and murdered 11 women did not merit mercy. Crawford was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. He died there on March 18, 2017, 2 days before his 55th birthday. The cause of death was not reported publicly in detail. He had served 7 years of a sentence that would have run for the rest of his life in any case. The 11 women he killed between 1993 and 1999 in the abandoned buildings of Englewood died in a neighborhood that the city's resources had largely stopped reaching, in circumstances that made their disappearances less visible than they would have been in other parts of the same city. The DNA database that finally produced his name was not yet mature enough in 1993 to have caught him earlier. By the time it was, 7 women were already dead. The investigation found him when the tools available to it were finally capable of finding him. The shoes, all 11 pairs, were never recovered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 11 murders in a single neighborhood, DNA that took years to produce a name, and a jury that stopped 1 vote short of the death sentence. The next figure on this list is the most recent entry in this video and the one whose conviction turned most directly on forensic advances that had not existed when the crimes were committed. A suburban killer who lured women through classified advertisements and set fire to some of what he left behind. Section 8. Paul Runga. Paul Runga was 17 years old when he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl in Oak Forest, Illinois in August 1987, held her captive for nearly 15 hours, and subjected her to repeated sexual assault and sustained physical violence. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and armed violence. He received a 14-year prison sentence and served 7 years of it. He was paroled in 1994 and, within the first weeks of his release, killed his first known victim. Between January 1995 and March 1997, at least 7 women and girls died in the northern Illinois suburbs and on Chicago's northwest side. Their bodies were burned, dismembered, or both. Runge accessed his victims through classified advertisements they had placed in local newspapers and for sale signs posted outside their homes. He presented himself as a prospective buyer. He came through the front door. Paul Frederick Runge was born on January 28, 1970, in Oak Forest, Illinois. He grew up in the northern Illinois suburbs and had no notable criminal history before the age of 17. On August 17, 1987, he lured a 14-year-old girl to his home in Oak Forest and held her there for close to 15 hours, subjecting her to repeated sexual assault and severe physical violence. He then fled. Over the following week, he made telephone calls to police from wherever he was, and eventually agreed to give officers an address at which he could be arrested. He was taken into custody without incident. He pleaded guilty to charges of kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and armed violence, and received a 14-year prison sentence. Psychologists who later evaluated him described his conduct as that of a sexual sadist who had demonstrated, even at 17, a level of premeditation and sustained cruelty that was not consistent with impulsive behavior. He served approximately 7 years. He was paroled in 1994. After his release, Runge moved to Carroll Stream, a suburb in DuPage County west of Chicago, found work at a Lady Foot Locker store, and became engaged. To anyone who encountered him, he appeared to be a man reintegrating. He was 24 years old, working a retail job, and living in a commuter suburb indistinguishable from a dozen others in the region. The probation conditions attached to his release required him to report regularly and prohibited him from possessing weapons. Investigators who later reviewed his parole file found nothing during this period that indicated he was escalating. The first murder took place on January 3, 1995, less than a year after his release, at a townhouse complex where he was living in Streamwood. Stacy Frobel was 24 years old, a part-time waitress from Carroll Stream, and an acquaintance of Runge's fiancée. She visited the townhouse on January 3, 1995, and was never seen alive afterward. Her absence was reported the following day. Approximately 2 weeks later, a German Shepherd named Friendly brought a severed human leg to its owner's home in a rural area near the Illinois-Wisconsin border. 5 days after that, the same dog returned with the other leg. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Stacy Frobel. The rest of her body was found in pieces across rural Lake County and southern Wisconsin. She had been dismembered, and the parts distributed across a wide geographic area in what investigators recognized as an attempt to prevent identification and to scatter evidence. Police immediately focused on Runge. Frobel had been at his home, she had not left alive, and the disposition of her remains pointed to a perpetrator who had access to a vehicle and who had spent time planning how to prevent the body from being found intact. Runge, when questioned, denied knowing anything about her disappearance. What followed was an investigation that ran for 2 years alongside an active killing spree. In the summer of 1995, 2 sisters named Dzaneta and Amela Pasanbegovic, Bosnian refugees aged 22 and 20, disappeared. Their bodies were never recovered. Investigators believed they were among Runge's victims and that they had been killed and dismembered in a manner that left nothing recoverable. The FBI, working with local agencies, recruited a friend of Runge's to carry a concealed recording device and steer conversations toward the Frobel killing. The conversations produced nothing usable. In March 1996, officers found a knife in circumstances that would later be acknowledged as a missed opportunity. The FBI and the local agencies involved did not use the discovery to invoke a parole violation on the weapon possession grounds that were available to them. A spokesman for the FBI's Chicago office later confirmed that investigators had been focused exclusively on building a murder case rather than using the parole condition as a mechanism to remove Runge from circulation. The knife stayed in evidence. Runge stayed free. In January 1997, he killed again. Dorota Jubak was 30 years old, a single mother with a 5-year-old daughter, living on Chicago's northwest side. She had placed an advertisement in her local paper with the intention of selling her home. Runge responded to the advertisement and came to the property, presenting himself as a potential buyer. He gained her confidence over what her friends later described as a period in which he appeared entirely plausible as a purchaser. On January 10, 1997, he entered the home, raped and strangled Jubak, and set the building on fire before leaving. Firefighters responding to the fire found her body. Phone records established that on the day of the fire, Jubak had received a call from a payphone in close proximity to her home. Her daughter was not in the building at the time. 3 weeks later, on February 3, 1997, a neighbor in an apartment building on the 3100 block of North Laramie Avenue noticed flames and called the fire department. Firefighters found 2 bodies on a burned bed in a studio apartment. They belonged to Yolanda Gutierrez, 35 years old, and her 10-year-old daughter, Jessica Muniz. The fire investigation determined that a flammable accelerant had been poured onto the bed and over both victims before being ignited, leaving pour patterns visible on the surrounding floor. DNA recovered from Jessica's body provided the forensic connection that would eventually produce Runge's conviction. The apartment had been accessed because Yolanda Gutierrez had a for sale sign posted relating to household items. Runge had come to look at the items on January 31st. He returned on February 3rd. In March 1997, Kazimiera Peruch, 43, was killed after encountering Runge through an advertisement for the sale of her condominium. With her death, the series reached the end of its active phase. Investigators in the suburbs and in Chicago were by now fully alert to the pattern. A woman was raped and killed after responding to or placing a classified advertisement. The perpetrator gained entry through an expression of ordinary consumer interest and left without witnesses. In May 1997, investigators finally resolved to use the parole violation route they had declined to pursue 14 months earlier. Runge was detained for possession of a weapon, a breach of his parole conditions. Illinois authorities jailed him. When his parole term expired in 1999, they moved to keep him incarcerated under the state's Sexually Violent Persons Act, presenting testimony from psychologists who described him as a sexual sadist who had shown no remorse for the 1987 rape and who presented an ongoing risk. While those legal proceedings were underway, DNA analysis from the Gutierrez-Muniz crime scene was run through the available databases and returned a match to Runge's profile. Confronted with the DNA result, Runge initially denied any involvement. After several hours, he requested to give a statement. The statement was recorded on videotape and covered 7 murders. He described each killing with a composure that investigators and prosecutors found consistent with the absence of any moral register around what he had done. He described the for-sale advertisements, the visits, the entry into homes. He described the Pasenbegovic sisters. He described Dorota Jubak's house and the fire. He described the studio apartment on North Laramie Avenue and both of the people inside it. Cook County State's Attorney Richard Devine, responding to the charges filed in June 2001, said that Runge was their worst nightmare, a man who had conned his way into women's homes by appearing to be an ordinary buyer and had then raped and murdered them. The characterization was plain and accurate. In 2000, while being transported to a court hearing in Cook County, Runge overpowered a corrections officer with the assistance of 2 other inmates during a stop in Plainfield, Illinois. He was free for a short time. Local police recaptured him and the 3 men were returned to custody. He was subsequently convicted of attempting to escape. The incident added to a profile that prosecutors would later use in arguments about the appropriate sentence. The trial that prosecutors brought first was the strongest one. In January 2006, Runge stood trial in Cook County specifically for the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz, the case in which the DNA evidence was most direct and the crime scene reconstruction most complete. The defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury rejected it. On February 10, 2006, Runge was found guilty of both murders. 4 days later, the jury determined he was eligible for the death penalty on 8 separate statutory grounds. The grounds included the age of Jessica Muniz, which made her death subject to special provisions. the intentional and tortured nature of both killings, and the premeditated use of an accelerant. After considering evidence in aggravation and mitigation, the jury concluded that death was the appropriate sentence. Cook County Judge James Egan formally imposed the sentence in June 2006. Prosecutors described Runge as the face of the death penalty in their public statements, a case they intended to use in ongoing debates about capital punishment's retention in Illinois. The Illinois Supreme Court reviewed the conviction and sentence in 2009. In a 4-3 decision issued on May 21, 2009, the majority upheld the conviction and the death sentence. The 3 dissenting justices argued, in a sharply worded opinion, that Runge deserved a new trial on procedural grounds relating to jury conduct during deliberations. The majority found these arguments insufficient. Runge remained on death row at Pontiac Correctional Center, one of 15 men awaiting execution in the state of Illinois. On March 9, 2011, Governor Pat Quinn signed legislation abolishing capital punishment in Illinois entirely. As part of that act, the sentences of all 15 men on Illinois death row were commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Runge was among them. DuPage County State's Attorney Robert Berlin subsequently announced the dismissal of the remaining charges against Runge, covering the killings of Stacy Frobel, Dorota Jubach, and Kazimiera Peruch. Berlin stated that pursuing those cases would serve no practical purpose since no additional punishment could result from conviction. Each of those 3 cases therefore closed without a verdict. The families of those 3 women received no formal judicial accounting of their deaths. Runge remains at Pontiac Correctional Center serving life without parole. He has not given a public interview. He submitted written answers through his father to a newspaper in 2006 during the trial period and has not communicated publicly since. The DNA that linked him to the Gutierrez Munoz apartment had not been in any database capable of returning a match when the murders were committed in 1997. It became usable against him 2 years after the fact, while he was being held on other grounds. Without the for sale sign in the window of the apartment on North Laramie Avenue, and without the DNA recovered from that apartment, the case against Runge may not have been buildable. The 7 people he is known to have killed were reached through the ordinary mechanisms of daily suburban commerce. He did not need to find them in any other way. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Classified advertisements, house viewings, and fire used as a means of concealment. The next case on this list moves back in time, not forward, to a Kenwood afternoon in 1924 and 2 university students who planned a murder, not for money, not for rage, but to prove they were intelligent enough to get away with it. One of the most celebrated trials in American legal history followed. The sentence it produced was life plus 99 years. Section 9. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. On the afternoon of May 21, 1924, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb drove a rented Willie's Night automobile through Chicago's Kenwood neighborhood, looking for a child to kidnap and murder. They had already typed the ransom note 10 days earlier using a stolen typewriter and a fictitious name. They had already opened a bank account and rented a post office box under assumed identities. They had a chisel on the rear seat, a bottle of hydrochloric acid, and a section of marshland near the Indiana state line already chosen as the disposal site. Leopold was 19 and had graduated from the University of Chicago. Loeb was 18 and had graduated from the University of Michigan at 17, reportedly its youngest graduate. They had been planning the crime for the better part of 2 years, on the basis that their intelligence placed them outside the moral framework governing everyone else. The first suitable boy they saw walking alone was 14-year-old Bobby Franks, Richard Loeb's second cousin, who recognized the face at the car window and got in. Nathan Leopold had enrolled at the University of Chicago at 15 years old. He spoke several languages, was a serious and accomplished ornithologist who had already published work in the field, and had constructed his personal philosophy almost entirely around his reading of Friedrich Nietzsche, in particular the concept of the Superman, the individual of sufficient intelligence and will to stand above conventional morality and operate without its constraints. The concept was not original to Leopold, but his application of it was specific. He genuinely believed that certain people, himself among them, were exempt from the ethical frameworks that governed ordinary human beings. Richard Loeb had no particular interest in Nietzsche. His obsession was crime itself. He had been reading detective fiction since childhood, and had developed, through that reading, a conviction that the execution of a perfect crime was the highest demonstration of intelligence available to a person of his capabilities. He had been committing small crimes since adolescence: theft, arson, vandalism, petty fraud. None of it had produced any consequences. The absence of consequences reinforced his confidence in his own impunity. What he needed, eventually, was a collaborator of sufficient intellectual standing to help him plan something at the scale he had in mind. The two young men had known each other since childhood. They lived on the same streets in Kenwood, their families occupying adjacent positions in the same social world. Both came from significant wealth. Leopold's father was a retired businessman and box manufacturer. Loeb's father was a vice president of Sears, Roebuck. The arrangement that developed between them in the years before 1924 was explicit in ways that both would later describe in detail during investigation and in court. Loeb wanted a criminal accomplice. Leopold wanted proximity to Loeb. The arrangement they reached was that Leopold would participate in Loeb's schemes in exchange for a kind of closeness that Loeb was otherwise unwilling to sustain. The transaction was uncomfortable enough that both of them returned to it repeatedly in later testimony and confession, each framing it differently and neither framing it in a way that fully resolved what the other had said. What is documented is that the two young men had been committing minor crimes together for several years before 1924, and that by early 1923 Loeb had determined that the culminating demonstration of his capacities would be a kidnapping and murder, planned so carefully that no investigator could trace it back to its source. The planning took over a year. They chose the name Morton D. Ballard as an alias for the car rental and the bank account. They chose George Johnson as the fictional sender of the ransom note. They stole a typewriter from a University of Michigan fraternity house during a visit to campus to use for the note, on the calculation that a typewriter belonging to neither of them could not be traced to either. The note itself was typed and addressed to no specific person, because the victim had not yet been selected. It demanded $10,000 in old, unmarked bills and gave precise instructions for the delivery, including a specific payphone the victim's father was to call. The operational detail of the note was considerable. It had been written before any victim existed. On the morning of May 21, 1924, they rented the Willie's Night from a rental facility on Michigan Avenue, using the Ballard alias. They drove to the area around the Harvard School for Boys in Kenwood, where they had attended school and where they knew the patterns of the students who walked home in the afternoons. Their first identified target was a classmate of Loeb's younger brother. They followed this boy for a distance and lost sight of him. They continued circling the same streets. The ransom note was in the car, already addressed to no one in particular, already signed, already stamped. It needed only a name filled in and a family to receive it. The boy they eventually pulled alongside was Bobby Franks, walking home from a baseball game after school, 13 years old according to some records and 14 according to others. He knew the Loeb family. He had played tennis at their estate. He accepted the suggestion that he get in the car because the face at the window was familiar. Within a short distance of the Harvard School, Loeb struck Bobby Franks on the top of the head with a chisel. A cloth was pushed into his mouth. Bobby Franks died in the back seat of the car, most likely of suffocation, within minutes of being struck. Leopold continued driving south through the afternoon traffic of Chicago, while the body of a 14-year-old boy lay on the floor of the rear seat. They stopped at a roadside lunch counter somewhere south of the city and ordered food. They ate. They continued south toward the Indiana state line. Near 118th Street and the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, in the marshy ground beside Wolf Lake on the border of Illinois and Indiana, they stopped the car, removed Bobby Franks's clothing, poured hydrochloric acid over the boy's face and genitals to make identification more difficult, and pushed the body into a concrete drainage culvert beside the railway embankment. They drove back to Chicago. Loeb burned the clothing in the furnace at his family's home that evening. One of them telephoned Jacob Franks, Bobby's father, that same evening and told him that his son had been kidnapped but was safe, and that a ransom letter would arrive the following morning. They mailed the letter. Then they slept. The body was found the following morning, May 22nd, by a worker taking a shortcut home from an overnight shift. He found it in the culvert at 118th Street. Officers responding to the scene found a naked boy, his face discolored from the acid, and lying a short distance away in the vegetation beside the culvert, a pair of tortoiseshell eyeglasses. The glasses had a distinctive feature. The hinge mechanism used to connect the frame to the arms was a relatively new patented design, and it had been sold by a single Chicago optometrist to exactly 3 customers in the city. One of those customers was Nathan Leopold. When investigators ran the glasses, they had a name within days. The ransom note, at the same time, was drawing its own scrutiny. The typewriter used to produce it had 2 defective keys that left identifiable marks on each letter. Leopold's fraternity brothers at the University of Chicago identified the machine as one he had used. The typewriter itself was found later in a lagoon, where it had been thrown after Leopold and Loeb learned the body had been discovered before the ransom could be delivered. Leopold was brought in for questioning and remained entirely composed. He had an explanation for the glasses. He had dropped them, he said, during a bird-watching visit to the marshland near Wolf Lake, which he made regularly as part of his ornithological work. The explanation was plausible because he genuinely did visit that area to observe migratory birds. He and Loeb had also prepared an alibi for the afternoon and evening of May 21, a detailed account of driving around Chicago with 2 women whose names they provided. The alibi was checked. Inconsistencies emerged. Details that Leopold and Loeb had agreed on in their account did not match what investigators were finding when they looked at the physical record of where the car had been and who had seen it. Over 10 days of sustained questioning, the alibi came apart. On May 31, 1924, both men confessed. The confessions were detailed, composed, and consistent on all the major points. They described the planning, the typewriter, the chisel, the acid, the lunch counter stop with the body in the vehicle, the culvert, the phone call to Jacob Franks. They had, by several accounts, discussed their methodology with the same equanimity they would have brought to any academic exercise. The families retained Clarence Darrow. He was 67 years old, the most celebrated criminal defense attorney in the United States, a committed opponent of capital punishment who had built his career on cases that required him to persuade courts to show mercy toward people who had done things that made mercy difficult to justify. He understood from the first conversation that Leopold and Loeb had no defense in the conventional sense. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions complete, the guilt not in question. What Darrow was being asked to do was prevent 2 young men from being hanged, and the mechanism he chose for that purpose was to waive the right to a jury trial and argue the sentencing question before a single judge. Judge John R. Caverly agreed to hear the case in that form. Both defendants entered guilty pleas. There would be no jury to convince and no verdict to reach. The entire proceeding was a sentencing hearing, and its outcome would depend entirely on whether Darrow could move one judge. The state's attorney, Robert Crowe, presented the case for death with 100 witnesses and a meticulous reconstruction of the crime. He argued that the premeditation was so complete, the cruelty so sustained, and the absence of remorse so absolute that any sentence other than execution would represent a failure of the justice system to respond proportionately to what had been done. He was not wrong about any of those observations. The defense presented psychiatric testimony arguing that both defendants were psychologically abnormal, that their emotional development had been arrested in ways that limited their capacity to fully comprehend the moral weight of what they were doing, and that killing them would accomplish nothing that life imprisonment could not. Darrow began his closing argument on August 22, 1924. The courtroom was packed to its limits. Hundreds of people stood in the corridors outside and in the street. He spoke for more than 12 hours across 2 days. The argument was sprawling and deliberately so, moving between philosophy and science, and poetry and history, and the simple fact of the defendant's youth, in ways that were calculated to make the question of whether to hang them feel less like a legal determination and more like a referendum on what kind of society Illinois intended to be. He quoted poets, he cited psychiatric literature, he talked about determinism and about the randomness of the circumstances that produced the kind of thinking Leopold and Loeb had done. He said that the crime was the senseless act of immature and diseased children. He said that the state's desire for their deaths was itself a form of the violence it claimed to oppose. He said that he was pleading not just for 2 defendants, but for the principle that the taking of human life by the state was never justified. Judge Caverly, according to observers in the courtroom, had visible tears in his eyes by the time Darrow finished. On September 10, 1924, Judge Caverly delivered his ruling. He sentenced Nathan Leopold to life in prison for the murder of Bobby Franks and to an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. He imposed the same sentence on Richard Loeb. He cited their youth as the primary reason for declining to impose the death penalty, and he noted explicitly that he had received substantial correspondence from members of the public urging execution, correspondence he had considered and set aside. The prosecution described the outcome as a miscarriage proportional to the wealth the families had brought to bear on the defense. Darrow said only that the result was exactly what they had asked for and that it was still pretty rough. Both defendants were transferred to Stateville Prison. Richard Loeb's time in prison ended on January 28, 1936. A fellow inmate named James Day attacked him in the prison shower block. Loeb died of his wounds. He was 30 years old. The circumstances of the attack were disputed. Day claimed Loeb had made sexual advances, a claim that was contested and never fully resolved. Loeb's death received national coverage, and the coverage had a quality that the original sentencing had also carried, of a public that had never quite decided how it felt about the outcome of that August 1924 courtroom and had never quite found a way to close the question. Nathan Leopold served 33 years. He was paroled on March 13, 1958. He moved to Puerto Rico, where he found work in a church-sponsored hospital program and later in public health research. He earned a master's degree in social work from the University of Puerto Rico. He published a memoir in 1958 in which he described his time in prison and the events that had led to it with a degree of self-analysis that reviewers found either genuinely reflective or insufficiently remorseful, depending on what they were inclined to look for. He married a widow named Trudy Feldman Garcia de Quevedo in 1961. He continued the ornithological work that had been one of his serious preoccupations since adolescence, and he contributed to the scientific study of bird populations in the Caribbean in ways that were recognized by researchers in the field. He died of a heart attack in San Juan on August 29, 1971. He was 66 years old. The case sits at a specific point in the arc of Chicago's criminal history because the motive was, among all the cases in this video, the most purely theoretical. Holmes needed money. Gacy needed what the crawlspace contained. Speck needed control over the women in that townhouse. Crawford needed crack cocaine and what came after. Leopold and Loeb needed proof that they were right about themselves. The proof they sought was the successful commission of a murder that no investigator could solve. The glasses fell out of Nathan Leopold's pocket into the vegetation beside a drainage culvert near Wolf Lake, and the proof dissolved within 48 hours of the murder. Bobby Franks had played tennis at the Loeb estate. He had known the face at the window. He had trusted it enough to get into the car on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 4 blocks from his school, on a street he had walked every day of his life in a neighborhood that had given him no reason, before that afternoon, to be cautious about anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The investigation that eventually produced a name for their killer would take 39 years, and it would arrive not through any inquiry into the murders themselves, but through a federal fraud case involving the Chicago horse industry and the disappearance of a candy heiress. Section 10. Kenneth Hansen. On October 18, 1955, 2 days after 3 Chicago boys had not come home from a Sunday afternoon matinee, their naked bodies were found in a drainage ditch in Robinson Woods, a Cook County forest preserve on the northwest side near Lawrence Avenue and River Road. Robert Peterson was 14. John Schuessler was 13. Anton Schuessler was 11. They had been beaten, strangled with different methods applied to each, and bound with tape placed across their eyes and mouths. There was no physical evidence at the scene connecting the murders to any specific person or location. The case remained open and unsolved for 39 years, the longest-running and most prominent cold case in the city's history, until a federal investigation into horse industry insurance fraud and the 1977 disappearance of candy heiress Helen Voorhees Brock produced witnesses willing to name a stable hand called Kenneth Hansen, who had been telling people what he had done to those 3 boys since the week it happened. October 16, 1955, had been an ordinary autumn Sunday on the Northwest Side. Robert Peterson and the Schuessler brothers, neighbors and friends who lived a few blocks apart in the Avondale and Jefferson Park area, decided to go downtown to see a film. Robert's mother helped them choose it, a Disney nature documentary called The African Lion that was playing at the Loop Theater on West Randolph Street. She telephoned the theater to check the admission price and the running time. The film ran 90 minutes. The boys left the Peterson home between 3:15 and 3:30 in the afternoon, in good spirits, with enough money for the movie and the journey back. A classmate saw all three of them that evening at the Monte Cristo bowling alley on West Montrose, around 7:30, and they told him they had just come from the theater and were heading home. They were hitchhiking. Hitchhiking was an ordinary mode of transport for children in those neighborhoods in 1955, on streets that most residents described afterward as having felt safe enough to sleep with the front door unlocked. The boys were last seen in the area of Milwaukee Avenue near Lawrence Avenue, 8 miles from the theater. They had no reason to be wary of a car that stopped. Kenneth Hansen was 22 years old in October 1955 and had made his working life in the horse trade, a world that occupied a peculiar social position in the Chicago of that era. The industry stretched from the city's edge into the surrounding suburbs, centered on stables that served wealthy riders, horse show competitors, and a network of breeders and traders whose operations ranged from entirely legitimate to deeply criminal. Hansen worked at or was closely associated with the Idle Hour Stables at 8600 Higgins Road on the northwest side, a facility connected to a man named Silas Jane. Jane was one of the most powerful figures in the Chicago horse world and one of its most feared. He had the temperament of a man who resolved disputes through violence and the connections to ensure that violence rarely produced legal consequences for him. He would go to prison in 1973 for conspiring to murder his own half-brother George, a crime that illustrated something about the scale of what he was willing to do and to whom. In 1955, Jane was at the height of his influence, and his stables were a place where a young man who worked for him moved with a degree of protection that the name provided. The account of what happened on the evening of October 16 that prosecutors eventually assembled came entirely from men who had heard Hansen describe it himself, in pieces, over the course of nearly 4 decades. The consistent elements across all of those accounts were these. Hansen picked the 3 boys up while they were hitchhiking on Milwaukee Avenue near Lawrence, lured them to the Idle Hour Stables under the pretext of showing them horses, and at the stables began sexually abusing the younger Schuessler brothers. Robert Peterson, the oldest of the 3, witnessed it. When confronted with the prospect of what Robert Peterson would tell when he got home, Hansen killed all 3. He told at least one person later that the calculation in the moment was a simple one. It was them or him, and in 1955, what he had done at those stables was something society would not accept. He used language close to those words in conversations with multiple people across the years that followed. He also used the murders as a threat. When disputes arose at stables he worked at or owned in later years, he would tell the person crossing him that they might end up like the Peterson boy. The threat was effective because the people he said it to understood it was not hypothetical. Silas Jane discovered what had happened in his stables. His calculation was also straightforward. A triple murder at his facility would have ended his business and brought investigators into an operation that had aspects he had strong reasons to keep private. He had the criminal infrastructure and the local connections to help manage what Hansen had done. The boys' bodies ended up in the drainage ditch in Robinson Woods. Their clothing and any trace evidence connecting the scene to the stable were removed. The city's investigators arrived at Robinson Woods 2 days later with nothing to work from except the bodies themselves and the manner in which they had been arranged, which told them the murders had been planned and deliberate rather than impulsive, and told them nothing at all about who was responsible. The case consumed the city in a way that cold cases rarely sustain across the years that follow their initial impact. The 3 boys had been ordinary children from ordinary Northwest Side families going to a Disney movie on a Sunday afternoon. The fact of their deaths and the manner in which they were found produced a grief in the city that was specific and lasting, and the absence of a resolution to that grief for 4 decades meant that it never quite closed. People who were children in Chicago in 1955 remembered the case for the rest of their lives as the moment the city's sense of its own safety changed. Investigators periodically revisited the file. Tips came in and were followed and led nowhere. The case remained open. The investigation that eventually produced Kenneth Hansen's name began with a completely different set of crimes and a completely different world. In the late 1980s, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were in Chicago investigating a large-scale insurance fraud operation centered on the horse industry. The scheme involved killing horses whose value had declined in order to collect on insurance policies taken out against them, a practice that was widespread enough in the Chicago area horse community to constitute an organized criminal enterprise. Running parallel to this was a separate federal investigation into the 1977 disappearance of Helen Voorhees Brock, the widowed heiress to the Brock candy fortune. Brock had been a devoted horse enthusiast and had been systematically defrauded by horse traders who sold her aging, overvalued animals at prices far exceeding their worth. She had left the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota in February 1977 and was never seen again. A smooth-talking stable owner named Richard Bailey was eventually charged with conspiracy to commit her murder, on the basis that he had arranged her death to prevent her from exposing the fraud. Bailey was convicted. The investigation that produced his conviction was the same investigation that, through the network of informants and witnesses it developed inside the Chicago horse world, surfaced Kenneth Hansen as the man who had killed Robert Peterson and the Schuessler brothers. The first witness was a man named Red Ouimet, who told investigators that during the 1970s he had heard Hansen make self-incriminating statements about the murders. Ouimet had reported this to the FBI at the time. The FBI had taken no action. A second witness, Herb Hollitz, testified that he had lived and worked at the Park Ridge stable for Hansen in 1952 and that they had had a sexual relationship. In October 1955, in the days immediately following the murders, Hollitz said Hansen had told him directly that he had just killed 3 boys he had picked up hitchhiking. Hollitz had said nothing to anyone for decades, including to his father, who was a Chicago police officer. The disclosure would have required him to acknowledge the nature of his relationship with Hansen, and in 1955, and in the years that followed, that acknowledgement carried consequences he was not willing to face. A third witness described Hansen threatening him with the fate of the Peterson boy during a dispute at a stable years after the murders. A fourth corroborated the account of the hitchhiking and the stable visit. All 4 had maintained their silence across different decades and for different reasons. All 4 came forward when the federal investigation gave them a context in which doing so was possible. In July 1994, Hansen was arrested on a warrant related to a 1970 arson at a competitor's stable business. On the same day, he was charged with the 3 murders from October 1955. He was 61 years old. He had spent the intervening decades working in the horse industry, at various points owning and operating his own stable businesses. During the questioning that followed his arrest, he denied the murders. He acknowledged that he had picked up male hitchhikers regularly over the course of his adult life, offering investigators an estimate that he had done so more than 1,000 times across 4 decades. He also acknowledged sexual contact with underage boys on numerous occasions. Both acknowledgments were striking in their frankness and consistent with the pattern the prosecution witnesses had described. The first trial opened in September 1995. The state's attorney, Jack O'Malley, was candid with the press before proceedings began. There was no physical evidence connecting Hansen to the murders. The case he was bringing was constructed entirely on the testimony of 4 witnesses who had received Hansen's confessions at various points across 39 years, on the documented pattern of his sexual behavior toward boys, and on a reconstruction of the route the victims had taken and the location of the Idle Hour stables relative to where they were last seen on Milwaukee Avenue. The defense argued that the witnesses were unreliable, that their accounts differed in detail, and that Hansen had been in Texas at the time of the murders. The forensic pathologist who testified at trial, Dr. Edmund Donahue, established that Anton Schuessler had been manually strangled, John Schuessler had been strangled in a manner consistent with a chokehold, and Robert Peterson had been strangled with a belt or rope-like object. Donahue also testified under cross-examination that the examination of the bodies had found no trace material such as animal hair, horse feed, or stable residue, a point the defense presented as inconsistent with a murder at an active working stable. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Hansen was sentenced to concurrent terms of not less than 200 years and not more than 300 years. The Illinois Appellate Court overturned the conviction on appeal. The court found that the trial judge had improperly admitted evidence that Hansen had routinely cruised streets and public areas seeking out young boys for sexual contact. That evidence, the appellate majority determined, had been presented in a form that was prejudicial beyond what the law allowed, and its admission required a new trial. One of the three appellate judges dissented, writing that the remaining evidence of Hansen's guilt was substantial enough that the jury would have returned the same verdict without the contested material. The dissent noted that 4 separate witnesses had provided accounts of Hansen's confessions that were consistent on all central points across decades of independent silence, and that this weight of testimony was not dependent on the improperly admitted evidence. The second trial took place in 2002. The same 4 witnesses testified. The same forensic pathologist provided the same medical findings. The jury again found Hansen guilty on all 3 counts of murder. The sentence was again 200 to 300 years. Hansen maintained his innocence through both trials and through the years that followed. He submitted statements through his legal representatives arguing against the reliability of the witnesses and contesting the prosecution's reconstruction of events. He died at Pontiac Correctional Center in 2007. He was 74 years old. He had denied the murders for 52 years, across 2 separate convictions, to every court and investigator who asked him. The people who had heard him describe what he had done were still alive. The 3 boys in Robinson Woods had been dead since October 1955. Robert Peterson was 14. John Schuessler was 13. Anton Schuessler was 11. They had been going to see a Disney film about lions on a Sunday afternoon, and they had trusted the face at the window of a car on Milwaukee Avenue because there was no reason, in the world they had grown up in, not to. The case that resolved their murders took 39 years to open and produced convictions with no physical evidence. Whether it produced the truth is the question that the record of 2 trials, 2 sentences, and 1 man's lifelong denial has not answered with the completeness that the 3 families who waited for an answer deserved. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.